All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to check out great theories of everything. All-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, tour de forces, and masterpieces from obscure sources. We hope that this serves your personal edification in terms of your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, and your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. Today is our 213th video on the Reciprocal Church, where we've attempted to kind of identify the problem and also to come up with solutions to the problem of religion in the West, that the Western religions are about to collapse under their own weight, the weight of fraud, and we're putting together resources that you can use in your own life to kind of assemble a spiritual life, one where you have reverence and you have kind of allegiances outside of your ego self. You see a higher purpose and a higher intelligence. And we've talked about entheogens, and we've talked about ecstatic music, and we've talked about hardcore endurance training and sacred geometry and mathematics. We'll be getting into some more of that as we go along. And also meditation techniques to bring upon what you'd call exotic states of mind. And so we've also been kind of deconstructing some of these old religions, in particular the New Testament. We'll be getting to the Old Testament soon. But the New Testament, according to me, from having gone over the sources, the New Testament was written by the Romans. It was obviously written by the Romans, in fact. They had the motive, the means, the method, and the opportunity to do so in the late 1st century. They needed to do so because the Jews, they were part of the Roman Empire, and the Romans just could not quell them. There was revolution after insurrection, after uprising among the Jews, and they just would not assimilate into Rome. They had this monotheistic religion that was very exclusive and xenophobic, and they just didn't really want a statue of Caesar in their temple. They didn't want to compromise on any of their kosher food laws or their circumcision rituals, their animal sacrifice rituals. And so the Romans, under Emperor Tiberius in the 30s, put together what's called the Committee to form a new Roman religion. And the idea was to basically replace the religion of the Jews with this new religion, where they cooked up the ideas of a Prince of Peace, a Jewish Prince of Peace, who believed in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to walk an extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack, and to generally just be content with your low pay or even your slavery. And so they wrote that up, didn't really get a whole lot of play, because by the time I guess they got finished, Nero was the emperor, and I believe Nero had a Jewish wife, but for whatever reason he rejected the idea, and so they cooked up an assassination plot for Nero, and it failed. Nero snuffed it out, and he executed his former tutor Seneca the Younger, along with Gaius Piso, and so his son Arius Piso kind of took up the family business, and he started writing the Gospels from what kind of was left to him, which was what we call the Q text. So it was like a pre-marked text that that the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke used to kind of as a source material. So his father had written the source material, and he put together the synoptic Gospels in starting about 70 AD. The war against the Jews, the big war, started in 66 AD. The siege of Jerusalem was about 70 AD, and it lasted till really 73 AD. Sometime in that period Mark was written, and then Matthew and Luke shortly thereafter. These things are powerful, magical texts. They have many layers of hidden meanings within them that you can only decipher by really digging deep, which some authors have, especially Abelard Rochlin, who wrote the true authorship of the New Testament back in 1979. Many kind of royal descendants had known about this for many years and wrote about it in veiled language, but Reuchlin was the first, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, Reuchlin, Reuchlin. He wrote about it explicitly, and he really dug it up by looking at all the Romans, their writings, their letters to each other, and really it was done through deciphering their aliases and pen names. They wrote under a bunch of different pen names, so it was very difficult to keep track of who was writing what. But you just have to keep in mind that the Romans had total control at this time. And so really anything that was written by the Romans, and in particular by the Roman court of the emperor. At the time, Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, and kind of the shadow emperor, who was Arius Piso. They all were generals in the war against the Jews. They all fought against the Jews, and then when they came back triumphant to Rome, they put together the Christian religion. And Arius Piso wrote under the name of Josephus. So he wrote the Gospels under the name of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he wrote the official history of the Jewish war in his Wars of the Jews that came out right at the same time. And if you read those two texts together, the New Testament and Wars of the Jews, you can recognize that they were written by the same individual, or at least group of individuals, and that they parallel each other, they parody each other, they go back and forth between each other. And that's why we're checking out some of the work of Michael Menesgotz, Menasgotz, who put out this book just recently, end of 2024, called Christianity's Origins, the Flavian Secrecy Cult. The Flavians were the emperor, the dynasty of emperors, beginning with Vespasian and also including his sons Titus and Domitian, from 69 to 96 AD. And what Menesgotz does is he finds just more and more parallels between the Gospels and the Wars of the Jews, but in particular he looks at the book of Luke and plots the points of parallels between the two. So Luke is on the vertical axis, the Wars of the Jews by Josephus is on the horizontal axis, and then when there's a correspondence, you know, he puts a dot there, and it spells out 5 Latin letters. When you do that, APTVS, which I think is clearly Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus. The Titus Vespasianus is actually minted on Roman coins from 80 AD or 81 AD. They have that imprint TVS, and then the AP seems to be obviously Arius Piso, but Menescats has a few other ideas about this, so I'm certainly open to that. I'm quite sure that the Romans did it, but I'm not totally sure which Romans did it. So we will be going over the book of Luke in detail and looking at, I believe he has about 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. You know, some of them are very obvious. Some of them are, you have to kind of know some background information to be able to tune into. You know, so once you kind of have to be looking for it. They're not obvious until you start to look for them. But some of them are so obvious that they've stuck out, and other scholars over the years have noticed them. Okay, we're going to just the summary of the historical timeline. We're still in introduction here. In addition to their reign names, Vespasian and Titus confusingly had the same birth name, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, whilst the younger son Domitian was called Titus Flavius Domitianus. I will refer to them simply as Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. The diagram below illustrates a timeline to which historians would agree on at least the majority of it and should not find the rest of it too objectionable. For the Gospel of Luke, I exclude the minority view that it was written before the events of 69 AD, that it refers to. Which leaves us with the mainstream view that it was written during Vespasian and Titus's reign, which started in 69 AD, and Titus died in 81 AD. Domitian took over after that until 96. I show the political context above the timeline. The politics of the era was dominated by Vespasian, who left his son Titus defeating Judea. Okay, so Vespasian was the first general there, but then he eventually became emperor. And so when he became emperor, Titus, his son, took over as the general. Now, Arius Piso also had the name Titus because he's in the same family. And so there is a little bit of question as to when you're referring to Titus. Are we referring to Piso, or are we referring to Titus, Vespasian's son, the emperor? They were kind of co-emperors, from what I understand. Whilst he led his forces to Rome to emerge nearly simultaneously as the victor of the Roman Civil War and ruler of the entire empire, which began the Flavian era, 69 to 96 AD. Okay, so after Nero was assassinated in 68 AD, there was like the year of the 4 emperors. And so there were 3 emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who all became emperor for very short periods of time. And I think all of them were killed. Maybe one of them survived, but they were all deposed, and eventually Vespasian took over when he killed, I think Arius Piso actually killed Vitellius. They talk about him smiting Vitellius, but Vitellius fought back, and he smote Arius Piso, but missed mainly, but cut his ear off. So he had half an ear because his assassination attempt didn't go perfectly, but he did get the job done apparently, and Vespasian became emperor. Okay, so civil war in Rome, 68 to 69 AD, the year of the four emperors. Great Roman Jewish War starts in 66 AD and largely ends with the fall of Jerusalem in 69 AD. But the fighting continued, especially down to Masada, which was a big fortress further south, up to 73 AD. Okay, so we've got all the different emperors listed here, starting with, well, Julius wasn't an emperor, but then Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, going from 27 BC up to 68 AD. And then that was the year of the four emperors, 68 to 69. And then the new dynasty of the Flavians came in. Flavian means blonde or golden. And so the Flavians came in with Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And then Domitian was assassinated in 96 AD. Nerva took over, and that was when Arius Piso pretty much took complete control. According to Roman Piso, Domitian banished Arius Piso. So there was a rift there, and he was banished from Rome until 96 AD when they assassinated him. And then Nerva took over, and Nerva brought him back. And then he was a relative of Trajan, who became emperor in 98. And also Hadrian, who became emperor in 117. Okay, now the period that the Gospels say Jesus lived is much earlier, from 1 AD or 0 whatever to 33 AD. But these are backdated, so by generally exactly 40 years, although I don't know that Menescats brings that up. But so one of the reasons to backdate it was to take people off the track, but also to make the prophecies that Jesus makes are, even though he uses symbolic, parabolic language, those prophecies are or predictions are fulfilled by Titus in the Jewish War, and that's a pattern that is common among when you read them both at the same time. Okay, let's go to religious and literary context. The only reason for thinking Jesus lived around 1 to 33 AD is because the Gospels say so. So what is actually different between the Christian viewpoint, the secular and mythicist viewpoint, and my thesis? This is Menescats talking right here. While many secular scholars conclude that Jesus is real, many others conclude that there is no real evidence that Jesus existed, often seeing Jesus' story as an amalgamation of earlier myths or other leaders called Jesus. And if a specific person could be identified that it is based on, he wouldn't be someone who lived specifically around 1 to 33 AD. My thesis, like Joseph Atwill's, the author of Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, is that the Gospels were written by the Roman government in the AD 70s, CE 70s, I guess, taking advantage of the existing Pauline literature, which I strongly disagree with. He's saying that the Pauline literature already existed. Reuchlin and Piso really talk about how the Pauline literature is definitely written by Pliny the Younger in a much later period, about 100 to 105 AD or 100 to 110 AD. and they looked at a lot of Pliny's writings. Piso both of them, I believe, independently discovered that if you look, not only does Pliny write in epistles, but they match each other every other word for a long period. They go every other word where they use the same word. So I don't believe that the Pauline literature existed already before this. The only reason that people say the Pauline literature is earlier than the Gospels is because they say that Paul, if he would have known about the Gospels, he would have alluded to them. But really, the purpose of the Pauline literature is to recruit non-Jews. The original intent of the Romans was to recruit Jews to their new religion, to convert Jews from Judaism to Christianity. But they realized that they could also apply this to slaves and soldiers and other commoners, and they could get them hooked on the religion too. And so that's what Paul is for. You know, Paul makes a bigger deal even than Jesus of, you know, not having to worry about, you know, stuff like circumcision and kosher food laws and, you know, sacrifice. These are things that Paul brings in order to kind of take the last vestiges of Judaism out of Christianity. So I disagree with him at this point, but maybe he can convince me otherwise. Okay, 13 letters attributed to Paul, which failed to mention Jesus' miracles and parables, and almost the entirety of his life story, other than that he was crucified. And these letters of Paul, they don't set themselves in time or place. They could be at any time or place. Well, not place, but any time. And they made up that this Jesus had lived and died a convenient length of time earlier, since that would make it hard for anyone to dispute it. Now, I don't know why Menescot's doesn't look very closely like Joseph Atwill does here, where Joseph Atwill goes over Wars of the Jews carefully along with the Gospels and shows that the events are offset by exactly 40 years to the day in many cases, between the Passover of 73 and the Passover of 33, and the Passover of 70 and the Passover of 30. So I'm not sure, you know, we still are in the introduction. Hopefully he will bring that evidence forward as well. So to ensure the context of the rest of this book is clear, I'm suggesting that the Gospels were written after Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 69 AD, and that the author made up the life story of Jesus and the idea that Jesus lived around 1 to 33 AD. Why it matters. This has immense importance because 1 billion people believe in Jesus and follow the teachings of the Gospels. Huge numbers of people spend their lives dreading an eternity of torture, seeing their actions, impact, and suffering as unimportant compared to the infinite afterlife. It leads them to accept kings, dictators, and other leaders as put there by God, and thus to tolerate and support their wars. It forces believers to nurture their ability and ignore valid evidence, which drives the anti-science movement, and in turn undermines our ability to decide or to tackle global problems from pandemics to pollution, climate change, and ecosystem destruction. Perhaps most corrosively, it leads believers to view the acceptance of oppression and poverty as a virtue enabling governments to get away with ignoring systematic inequality, and in some cases offering negligible social security and or even minimal democracy. I completely disagree with what he's saying right there. I think, I recognize that Christianity is a fraud, but I still support, in general, Christian values. And I think that the Christians have done more than really anybody in this day and age to uncover what he's says that they're not. I see it much more as like a limited hangout. The Romans had to divulge a lot of good stuff in the Bible in order to get anybody to believe it. It's kind of just like a technology, kind of like the internet or something like that, where it's a mixed bag. It can be used for good and it can be used for evil, but it depends on how you use it. It's important to point out that it's fraud, absolutely. But where he's going with the climate change and pollution and anti-science and pandemics, this is all fraud. He's a victim of the religion of science, which is even more pernicious than the religion of religion. And Roman Piso falls into this trap as well, where Roman Piso actually capitalizes words like climate change and evolution that, explicitly shows that he is religious toward science. So, I don't have a problem with like the scientific method or whatever, but the level of fraud that is within academia and, like the military-industrial complex and the big pharma and the medical industry, the fraud there is even thicker than it is in religion. So I don't want to hear that. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from basically, let's just look at this stuff rationally, reasonably, and with reality. And okay, this is a fraud. That doesn't mean that your experience of Jesus is a fraud. It doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just, like Roman Piso says, it just means that Jesus never existed. And it means that it was part of wartime propaganda of the Romans to manipulate you. But one's own experience of the divine within themselves, people call it Jesus, or people call it Allah, or people call it God, or people call it the Creator, or the One, or the Great Spirit, or whatever. I'm not discounting that. I'm just talking about the actual existence. And this other propaganda, it can be destructive, but I look at it way more as like a limited hangout, where it's like they had to give you some truth for you to believe it. They had to. It was a concession, because the Jews had basically elicited that concession, because they were such a pain to the Romans that the Romans finally had to recognize, well, we're going to have to, come up with our own religion for them. And, well, we're going to have to put some very useful stuff in there. And then it's a matter of whether you use it, just like the internet. The internet is a military weapon, but it can be used in a different way if you kind of understand. Or if we kind of understand. Okay. Now back to Menescot's. Sorry to be so editorial here. The bulk of my research was a 4-year effort to catalog the parallels between the Jewish War by Josephus, the famous Roman government's account, and even by mainstream standards, Josephus in his own autobiography, says that he was living at Rome in the court of the Caesars when he was writing this. Even though he was a Jewish general, his story is that he defected, and that he predicted Vespasian was going to become the new emperor. When he did, Vespasian pardoned him and brought him to Rome as the court historian, if you want to believe that. But it's in his autobiography. So Josephus's account of the destruction of Judea and the Gospels, ultimately focusing mostly on the Gospel of Luke. Wars of the Jews by Josephus is also a famous book, undeniably produced for the Flavian government of Vespasian and Titus, sometime in the 70s. And indeed, explicitly so, since it goes out of its way to state that these two emperors authorized their captured enemy, General Josephus, to write it. I will assume the reader knows of the Christian Gospel of Luke. Luke is one of the trio of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which contains a great deal of identical texts, a great deal of nearly matching text, and yet also a great deal of non-matching text, which each of the three Gospels arranges in a different order from the others. It is well known that there are parallels between Luke and Wars of the Jews. The very obvious ones are often dismissed as additions by some unknown Christian copyists in some early century, whilst most of the subtle ones go unreported. So a lot of people think that somebody in the Christian church much, much later doctored Josephus to put in, the matching language between Wars of the Jews and the Gospels. The idea that some of them are later additions is a troubled theory, since these additions are found in every surviving copy, and somehow all copies of the Slavonic version, which he calls the Slavonic Josephus, of Jewish War or Wars of the Jews, supposedly contain a different set of additions. Yet in both cases, these supposed additions do not align with what Christians would think. The best evidence for that theory is that these references to Jesus' story seem abruptly inserted into otherwise flowing text, whilst later Christian apologists who knew of Josephus' works didn't mention his references to Jesus when it would seem to be in their interest to do so.